I have been actually traveling across Southeast Asia over the past week and a half, meeting some amazing activists and journalists and bloggers and NGO professionals. And what has struck me most about the trip here, I've been here for the past 2 days. Christine, our campaigner here in the Philippines, has been taking me around meeting some amazing people, are two trends. At first is historically kind of amazing dedication and tradition of people power. You even have a word of it. And for us, this is what we see in lots of countries, but not as pronounced in most cases as we see here. Right? And the second is the incredible penetration of social media here. Not just the number of people that are involved, but the extent to which they are. And these are hugely important convergence of trends, and it's because of this that I think that based on all the observations we've had from around the world, that among all countries, I think the Philippines has one of the best potential of being one of the most powerful places in the world, but online movements driving offline change. So I want to talk about today how we see around the world the way social justice movements are changing. I'm going to start with a story that illustrates this. So, about 2 years ago, there was a woman walking down the street in Cape Town, South Africa. And she gets grabbed, and she's thrown into a shack, and she's raped, and she's almost killed. And the reason is she's a lesbian woman, and the man was trying to turn her straight. It's a phenomenon called corrective rape that happens 10 times a week in Cape Town alone. An awful, awful practice. So normally, that would be the end of the story. But what happened next is amazing. A friend of hers ends up deciding to stand up, and she goes to an internet cafe in Cape Town, starts a petition asking the Minister of Justice of South Africa to take action. The government hadn't taken action for decades, haven't even acknowledged the incident as an issue of public recourse. And over the next week, she gets 170,000 people from 150 countries, embarrasses the government, gets international news. The national public broadcaster brings on the Minister of Justice. It calls him to task, interrogates him, asks him why they have not addressed the issue. Subsequent to that, Ndume, the woman who started the petition, ends up mobilizing people offline, gets hundreds of people in front of Parliament, and after decades of entirely ignoring the issue in the context of some of the least empowered people on earth, the Minister of Justice passes a national task force to investigate and to stop the incidents of corrective rape. Right? An amazing story of injustice and overcome. This is from one of the most structurally unjust and overwhelmingly unpowerful person on earth. A woman who is a black, lesbian, South African female whose friend has just been raped. And she started one of the most powerful online movements in the history of her country. Right? Powerful stuff. Now, historically, starting offline movements has been extremely difficult, extremely expensive in time and in resources. And those barriers to starting movements have radically reduced and constrained the number that could be started. And I think we all know here we live in a very different time where the barriers to collective action are radically reduced. And what that does is allow anybody, anywhere, to start a campaign to mobilize others and advance change in real time. Now, the obvious observation lots of people make on this is the result is a radical increase in the number of campaigns that happens. Right? But what's actually really interesting is they're not just more numerous, they are different in kind. They look a lot different. Historically, we've seen social movements tend to be very large, about massive mobilizations, hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And we saw in the Arab Spring what looked to be a reflection of that, the first sort of emergence in really substantial ways of at least online social media for fundamental change. And the sort of observation that many people made because of that, the unique contribution of social media was to allow a small number of these massive campaigns, faster growing and more impactful than ever before. And I think that interpretation is largely wrong. Right? What's unique about social media is not allowing a small number of these massive movements, but a massive number of small movements, by distributing power more widely than ever before. Right? And the composition of that, the creation of that, allows what we call micro-movements, right? Things that are extremely small and specific and winnable. And because they're started by individuals and not organizations, they're rooted oftentimes in personal stories that takes abstract ideas that are oftentimes inaccessible and puts them in these accessible and personal and compelling narratives. So I'll give a couple examples of this. We've seen one of my favorite examples out of the US was about a year ago. And Bank of America, the biggest bank in America ends up levying a $5 fee to use your own bank card online, right? And it pissed a lot of people off. And normally, people might shout, and they might argue, and they may put suggestions in the suggestion box, but of course, instead, a 22-year-old part-time nanny, right, working 2 part-time jobs, Molly Catchpole, she starts a petition asking Bank of America to rescind the $5 fee. And she gets 300,000 people to take action over the next few weeks. She's a permanent fixture of mainstream media. She goes offline, she mobilizes people to pull their money out of the bank. She cuts her bank card in front of the press. And after about a month of campaigning, when Bank of America faces overwhelming negative response, the biggest bank in America rescinds the $5 fee in response to a 22-year-old part-time nanny, and subsequent to that, so do all other national banks considering the same thing. Now, you might say this is incredibly powerful, but also small. It's a $5 fee, and this is in the wake of Occupy Wall Street, where there's these massively ambitious goals of fundamental reform, of changing the structure of the banking system and finance, and it didn't get very far. It was abstract and slow and difficult and not specific. And what was powerful about Molly's story was it didn't end there. What happened is the inspirational value spawned hundreds and then thousands of more campaigns, changing banking policies from the ground up, stopping home foreclosures, and propagating a new movement against consumer problems for consumer advocacy that didn't exist before. That was what was powerful. Change things in ways that the big movement wasn't able to, even though it took lots of small steps. We see this, a lot of campaigns we've seen around Asia around corruption. Now in India, many of you might know, there's a huge protest over the past year and a half about corruption at the national level. Right? On a Hazare movement, millions literally of people trying to pass national legislation, and what you end up seeing is even insofar as that succeeds, it's extremely difficult to end corruption from the top down. Legislative corruption fixing almost never fixes the problem. But what was cool is we saw in the wake of that, only a few months ago, there's an engineering student in Bihar, India, a poor province in India, and he goes to renew his driver's license in person. And he gets asked for a bribe, which is quite common, and he denies the request, which is uncommon, and he gets beat up by the 2 officials. And again, the story would normally end there, but he records the incident with his mobile phone, the audio, and his friend starts a petition asking the district collector, their boss, to intervene. Now, this man has never faced public accountability pressure. It is a common occurrence. What happened? What happened next is not 440 local people took action, signed the petition, emailed the district collector. Many of them called the collector as well. There's a bit of media exposure, and embarrassed for the first time, exposed in a shameful way. The district collector suspended the 2 officials, passed an anti-corruption committee within that district, and committed publicly to root out the incidents of corruption around transportation. Right? Again, a pretty compelling case, but small. Right? An individual person in a small town in the north of India. But again, what happened next was what makes it so exciting, is it inspired a second person in the south of India to do the same thing, and then a 10th person, and then hundreds of people, and soon thousands of people building a movement against corruption from the ground up. Right? And what's interesting about this is it starts to change the incentives of public officials, because when you know it's possible that anybody can immediately start a campaign and shame you in public, right, it just increases the costs of doing so. It doesn't always mean you're going to win. Right? If you start a compelling campaign that resonates with people, you oftentimes have more influence than you could possibly imagine. We've actually seen this here in the Philippines, sort of launched operations only about 6 months ago. Started with about 27,000 users, now have over 300,000, tons of campaigns being launched. One of my favorite early on was, it's in Mindanao, it's sort of a small town in the south, and there's a wall that's actually breaking the landslide. There's a potential landslide occurrence on a regular basis because of mudslides, and there's a wall that's cracking. And because of that, the public teacher and the principal wants to lobby the local official to fix the wall. There's funds to fix the wall, but weren't given a clear case of small local corruption, an everyday occurrence. But instead of shrugging her shoulders, she just starts a petition, and she calls out the local representative for not giving the funds, and over the next 24 hours gets more than 1,000 people to join, gets media exposure, goes across social media, embarrasses local government, gets the attention of Manila, and after only 24 hours, commits to allocating funds and fixing that wall to prevent the collapse of the school. Again, someone who normally wouldn't have any power like that, hasn't had a voice in a long time, if ever, right? Super empowered over an elected official who previously controlled the purse that now she has influence over. Right? And I would bet you that that is not the last campaign that will happen around corruption in this country. It is just the beginning. Oh, part of the reason we think these campaigns are so powerful isn't just the direct impact that they have, right, but the inspirational value they have. It's not about changing policies, it's about changing culture and changing behavior. And one of the biggest, certainly around the world, impediments to social change is a sense of hopelessness, right? It's corrosive to democracy. And the reason that exists in such a persistent way in so many countries is because everyday experience has proven it time again. We're not born apathetic. We have the experience of having impotence, of having no impact, and we experience that so much so that we don't take action. But what's powerful about these small campaigns, they change that psychology. They end up mobilizing more people to realize their own power to make a difference. Right? And that is an incredibly influential thing. About 2 years ago, we had about 1,000 campaigns a month started on Change.org. And about a year ago, we had about 4,000, and now we have more than 25,000, more than 25 million users, and people power change every day, dozens of victories around the world. Right? So what does this look like? What are the consequences of technology radically reducing the barriers of collective action? I think it means a few things. One is, it means that people feel empowered like never before and can actually advance the change they want to see in the world. It means that governments and companies must think twice, right? Because constituents and consumers now have the rapid power to hold them accountable like never before. Right? And it means that people power is not episodic, but it is a daily reality. Right? And that is the world that, like many of you, I want to live in. Right? And I hope people around the world do, because it's here, right? And is only just beginning. Thank you.